About 4 years ago, I was a junior at a small college in LA County. Bordering my town was a large, cavernous region known as the Turnbull Canyon. It's the kind of place that has a healthy amount of creepy folklore surrounding it, with an area emphatically known as Hell's Gates, stories of cultic activity, gang killings, abandoned mental institutions, and the like. The kind of shit you hear about any place old enough to have a reputation. In reality, most of the stories were spurned from a tragedy that occurred years prior. A woman's body was found at the base of the canyon, and from then on the rest is history. Nevertheless, when a photographer friend asked me and another buddy to go out to the canyon in order to take some photos of the LA skyline, I had to oblige. The canyon was about a 30-minute drive from our campus, and we'd been listening to the King of Limbs the entire drive, which proved to be the perfect ambience to get me feeling pretty anxious about our little exertion. I should also note that I'm a pretty anxious guy in general, so travelling out to a remote area, preceded by its reputation for scary occurrences, admittedly had me thinking twice about the decision. At the top of the canyon, there is a small residential area, a few ritzy houses surrounded by trees and woods. In order to venture into the canyon itself, you have to follow a main trail with several smaller arteries that split off in other directions, but ultimately culminate after a couple of miles or so at the base of a steep hill adorned with an old water tower overlooking the city. Anyhow, we parked our car at the top of the canyon road, divvied up the camera gear, and made our way out to the trailhead around 1 AM by this point. After walking the trail for about 5 minutes, Dave, the photographer, decided it was time to set up his first shot, while Jeff, our other friend, and I kept watch. Eventually he got the shot he needed, and we continued walking for another 5 or so minutes before Dave decided to set up his next shot. At this point, the trailhead had disappeared behind us completely, and we were a little less than a quarter of the way to the water tower. While setting up the tripod, we noticed the faint glow of headlights off in the distance, which was strange because the trail isn't meant for cars, nor is it big enough for them to pass through. If I recall, it's only about 5 feet wide, with shrubbery on both sides. This was clearly a bit of a red flag for us, as we were the only people out there, so we immediately packed up our things and ducked off into the brush, waiting for the car to pass on. Eventually, an old pickup truck idled to a stop about 50 yards from where we were hiding. The truck itself was old and rickety, sitting on a lifted chassis, the bed of which was missing entirely. Growing up in the country, I knew it was a type of truck typically owned by a backwoods folk who lived in the boonies and preferred to be left to their own devices. We watched in agonizing anticipation as the truck just idled in place for several minutes before flooring it down one of the other trails, the roar of the engine echoing throughout the canyon. Clearly, we were spooked at this point, the three of us speculating to our next step. Jeff and I were reluctant to continue, while Dave assured us that it was probably nothing, perhaps just a guy off-roading, as he put it. So, with great reluctance, Jeff and I trudged on behind Dave towards the water tower to get his final shots. Nevertheless, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the truck. I mean, I knew plenty of people in high school who would go off-roading for fun in the woods, but never on finicky canyon trails barely wide enough to hike on, let alone drive. It just didn't sit right with me. After walking without interference for about an hour, we finally made it to the water tower, climbed the hill to the top, and took in the view of the city. Dave, once again, started setting up his equipment while Jeff and I stood on both sides of the water tower, keeping watch just in case the truck came back. Nothing. At this point it's around 3 AM. Dave decides that he's got all the shots he needs, so we pack up our equipment and commit to heading back before it gets too late, seeing as how all of us have classes in just a few hours. Just as we're preparing to descend the hill, the truck comes roaring out of the canyon below us, back onto the trail, at which point the driver attempts to climb the hill, revving the engine loudly. Scared shitless, the three of us slid off the side of the hill into the brush, clinging onto plants and rocks. As the truck finally made it atop the hill, slowly driving around the tower, we could see the glow of the headlights each time it circled above us. After waiting for nearly 10 minutes while also trying not to make any noise, The truck eventually descended the hill, stopping in the middle of the trail, not more than 100 yards away. We watched as a scruffy man, mid-50s, stepped out of the idling truck and into the glow of its headlights, moseying around while looking at the ground. He then knelt down, looking at something in the dirt, surveying the area intently. As he did so, it became increasingly apparent that he was tracking something. Our footprints. This next part still chills me to the bone. As my friends and I huddled together watching in complete horror, another man wearing a long, dark parka emerged from the brush, right where we had been hiking, joining the other man at his side. Apparently he'd been out there the entire time we were walking the trail, just watching us, following behind at a safe distance. The two of them talked for a long while, but we couldn't hear a word. They continued scanning the area, looking at our footprints, but eventually got in the truck and drove off down one of the forks in the trail. We sat in silence for a long time, waiting nearly 2 hours just to ensure the coast was clear, at which point we made like hell back to the car, down the canyon, and back to our campus, just in time for class. When I was 18, almost 10 years ago, I had a phone call that completely changed my life. I got woken up at almost 6 AM by an unknown number. I figured it was my boyfriend, now husband, since his phone usually showed up as the famous unknown number. He usually called me before going to work at around 7:30 AM, but sometimes he'd call me at 6ish if he wanted to talk to me while waking up. I answer, and he says,
"Hey baby."
And I'm still half asleep, but start talking. He tells me he has a little problem, and that he's feeling really, being 18 and having to start dating him recently. Let's just say I was very willing to, go and help his demands. So we start, and he tells me how he absolutely loved seeing me last weekend, how good I looked, how he absolutely loved my hot red panties. He basically described what we had done during the weekend, and how much he loved some of the things I did to him. I replied I was more and more awake and we were having a really good time. Then I noticed it was almost 7 AM and basically asked him, "So this is fun and all, but aren't you going to get ready for work?" This is giving me chills typing this, but he basically replied,
No, I think I'll skip work today. What about I come over?"
Now, the thing is, by then I was pretty awake, and although the voice that was talking to me was very similar to my boyfriend's, something threw me off. My boyfriend doesn't say the, no, like he does. And besides, I knew that unless he was ill, my boyfriend would never skip work because he was scheduled on shifts, and missing a shift was a big deal that could get him fired. I kinda froze. He noticed it, so he said,
"Oh, babe, you alright? I should start getting dressed. So, you want me to come over?"
By then, I swear that his voice was back to my boyfriend's voice, and I just felt silly. So what if he wanted to skip a day at work? Maybe he just wanted to see me. So I tell him, "Yeah, sure, come over. It will only be us here." He replied, "Great." Then he asked,
"Where is it?"
Wait, what? He'd been coming over for weeks now. I laugh it off and tell him, "Huh? You know where it is." That's when he laughed, and his laugh was absolutely not my boyfriend's laugh. I instantly told him, "You're not my boyfriend, are you?" He said,
"Can you just hang on, please? I need to grab something."
Meanwhile, I get a text from my actual boyfriend, and I figure that maybe this is just a sick joke. Maybe he coordinated it perfectly. Maybe he's ill and his voice doesn't sound the same. The text from my boyfriend said, "At the subway, going to work now, love you." I texted him back saying, "Why are you texting me? We are talking right now." At which point my actual boyfriend called. He was very confused at first and figured that someone had hacked into his MSN. When I told him that it was by phone, he reassured me that he absolutely did not call me and that whoever it was not him. He had to go because the subway train was there, but he will call me as soon as he was at work. Then, the other guy called back. I picked up, and I asked him, "Who are you? What do you want?" I pretty much went crazy on him. He said that his name was Mike, that we met a long time ago, which was impossible because my phone number was fairly recent, and that he just wanted to have fun, and that he didn't know I had a boyfriend. I asked him how he knew what I was wearing and about my red panties, and what we did, and how he got my phone number. He just said,
"Where are you? Why don't we just meet?"
At which point I hung up. He called again, and I didn't answer. Within minutes, I had called my mum to tell her what happened. She told me to change my phone number and not to stay at home alone. I changed my phone number right away. I also alerted local police. They opened a file, but nothing ever came out of it. I still wonder how he knew about what me and my boyfriend did, and what I was wearing. My boyfriend swore at the time that he would never tell any of his friends what we did, but his parents' house did have lots of windows, and we weren't exactly careful. This happened to me last summer. I'm a 22-year-old woman living in a small to mid-sized city. This happened to come up today with my co-worker and thought it would be good to share. Although I hadn't thought of it for a while, at the time I got pretty depressed and scared for about a month at least. I worked at a coffee shop that was open until midnight. Yes, midnight, in a neighborhood that isn't exactly known for its nightlife, although it isn't entirely dead after dark either. But apart from a diner a few blocks away, a pizza shop across the street, the bar on the corner, and the 24/7 convenience store and pharmacy, we were the only place open that late. Closing shift workers worked alone, but I had never been particularly bothered by it. I had lived in the neighborhood for a while, and I had heard one story of a woman my age being mugged near the shop, but other than that, things were fairly quiet. I lived about a 30-minute walk away, but at that hour, I typically took the bus. Usually the last one came at around 1 in the morning, which was enough time for me to close and still catch it. One night, I had just finished up at around 12:30. As I exited the shop and began to turn left, the direction of my bus stop, I saw a man walking down the sidewalk towards me to my right, so that when I started down the sidewalk, he was behind me going in the same direction that I was. It was a Saturday, so it wasn't particularly unusual for someone to be out at that hour. I figured he was headed up towards the bar, which I would pass on the way to the shop, and anyway, he was a good distance away, and yet I still had a bad feeling. As I walked, nearing the corner, I heard his footsteps quicken. I instinctively slowed, wanting to believe that he was going to pass me, but instead, he matched my pace once he was beside me, so that we walked side by side. I stiffened, but continued to walk. He kept about 2 feet between us and was muttering something. It seemed like he might be mentally ill, but I listened to what he was saying, and when I made out what he was saying, I went cold.
"Shouldn't have come out tonight,"
he said, over and over.
"It's a bad night. Shouldn't have come out. It's a bad night. Shouldn't have come out."
I had no idea if he was talking to me or to himself or what, but I was afraid. I suddenly felt like I was going to die. We passed the bar. I should have gone in and asked for help, but I had this absurd thought that since I didn't have my ID, they would card me, and I didn't want to make a scene. I reached the corner with him beside me. I hesitated a moment to make a decision, and he waited beside me as I did. He'd stopped muttering. The bus stop lay across the street on the opposite corner. No cars or people were in sight. On that corner across the street was the 24/7 convenience store. It was brightly lit, the only beacon in the otherwise silent and very dark night. I decided I would go in the store to see if he followed me. Part of me was still convinced that I was imagining it, overthinking it, being silly. I didn't want to think he was following me, and when the automatic doors whooshed open to let me in, part of me was sure that he wouldn't be at my heels. I didn't look over my shoulder to check, but I didn't hear the doors open for him either, or his footsteps. I relaxed, felt relieved. He gave up, or he was never following me in the first place. I walked over to the shampoo section. I'd been meaning to buy shampoo anyway, and I might as well get something out of my silliness. I stood there, staring at my options, when, out of the corner of my eye, at the end of the aisle, I saw him walk by. Immediately, I felt sick again. I picked up the shampoo I wanted and started wandering around the store in a panic without seeing him. But then it occurred to me that he might corner me in the abandoned part. We were the only people in there besides the two cashiers, so I quickly walked to the front, searching for where he was. I saw him at the makeup counter a short distance away, sitting in the stool and facing me and staring. I put the shampoo down on the counter. My heart was racing and I couldn't think straight. I had no idea what I was going to do next. If I left, he would follow me. I couldn't walk home because he would follow me there. I couldn't wait at the bus stop because he would be there. Just as the transaction finished, I got up the nerve. "Excuse me, I know this sounds weird, but I think that guy over there is following me," I said to the cashier. I sounded sheepish, bashful, not at all terrified like I really felt inside. Maybe that was why the cashier didn't take me seriously. He shrugged and laughed. I was about to kick him out for loitering. My face fell as I watched him walk from behind the counter towards the man. I knew that if he kicked him out of the store before I left, I would be doomed, because he would be out there waiting for me. I composed myself the best I could, put the shampoo in my tote bag, and walked out the doors. I don't really know what I was thinking when I turned right instead of going left towards my bus stop. Doing so took me past a window where I could clearly see into the front of the store. I saw the cashier reach him and start to say something, but he was staring at me. As soon as he saw me, he jumped and ran towards the front door. God knows why, but I started sprinting. I'm small and weak and have zero stamina, so there was no way I'd stand a chance even if I was running for my life. But I ran, and just as I did, my bus turned around the corner. The next stop was at the end of the block, so far away from where I was. I felt defeated, but I just kept running. My mind went blank as I watched the bus pass me. And then it stopped at the bus stop, for some strange reason. Never have I ever encountered such a merciful bus driver. And it stopped there, waiting for me. I jumped on, completely out of breath, but with fresh panic, because I had no idea if the man had got on behind me. He didn't. I sat down and started crying quietly. I told my manager the next day. She stopped putting me on closing shifts for a while. It took several other incidents of harassment, however, until the owners finally agreed to let us close at 10 instead of midnight. I happened to know one of the managers at the store he'd followed me into, and I considered asking to see the surveillance tapes, maybe make some effort to catch him. But all I really wanted to do was put the whole thing behind me. On Saturday, I got a call from a few friends about going to the mall. It was a stressful week at work, so I thought some retail therapy would definitely help. We shopped for the typical lady stuff like makeup, lingerie, and shoes before we decided on hitting the food hall for a spot of lunch. I gave the girls my order and told them that I would come and find them as I needed to use the restroom. The restrooms were at the end of a large and wide corridor. They were your typical mall type with lots of stalls. Anyway, so as I sat down to, and I could see from the gap on the floor between the wall of the stall and the floor, lots of movement from someone's shadow. I wasn't sure if they were getting changed or not, so I didn't pay much attention at first, but it felt like the shadow was coming from above at some points. As if the light from above were being obstructed by something. After maybe the third time I decided to look up, and I could see a phone and parts of a guy's arm leaning over. Someone was taking photos of me. I instantly shouted out, What the fuck you fucking pervert, what are you doing? And in a moment of sheer shock and disbelief, this all very quickly turned to fear as I got up and leapt out of the stall and was greeted by an empty bathroom. Not one person was in sight, and from the quick glance of the mirrors opposite, there was only one stall shut that was next to mine. I ran for the restroom exit, but it was locked. Luckily, it had a twist lock that I could turn, and as I did, I heard a stall open from behind me. I got out immediately and turned as I exited, and noticed a sign on the door saying, "Closed for maintenance." This sign was not here when I went in. I screamed some more, shouting to get anyone's attention as I ran down the corridor towards the food hall and had obviously caught the attention of a few people. A group of 3 guys stopped and clearly could see the panic in my eyes. They quizzed me, I explained, 2 of them ran towards the ladies' restroom and 1 to find security. Security arrived within seconds. After a while, a rather large crowd had gathered due to the commotion, and although I was in the comfort of my friends, security, and now the police, I had never felt more alone. Security and the police nor the 2 guys found anyone. There was a few staff only and fire exit doors down the corridor, so plenty of escape routes for whoever this guy was to go through. I gave my statement down at the station later that day once my parents showed up. The police said they had security tapes from the CCTV cameras that point down the corridor and will keep us updated with any news. Hopefully they find this guy. My sophomore year of high school, my friend was murdered. Going back, freshman year when I was in homeroom, I became friends with the girl who sat in front of me. Her name was Dina Wright. We came from the same neighborhood and both worked at a pizza shop a few blocks away. One night, I remember she had texted me asking if I wanted to do something. This was before everyone had unlimited cell phone plans. I had the Nokia that was basically a brick, and since I had to pay for minutes, we used to text, and if it was short, we could get away with not having to open it and therefore being charged the 0.5 minute. She told me she had a fight with her mum and felt like going out and smoking some weed. I had work and wouldn't be done till we closed up at 1 AM. Since I needed gas money, I told her that I wouldn't blow off work, but that I might come out afterwards. She sighed and said okay, and to text her when I was done work to see where she was at, because she didn't decide what she was gonna do yet. At 1:15, I texted her but didn't get a reply. No big deal, I thought. She probably was asleep. So, Saturday I text her again. Nothing. Sunday, nothing. Again, I thought she was probably grounded. That's why she was mad to begin with. She was grounded and went out. Got grounded again, left and went out again. Monday, I came into school and I hear the teacher make an announcement.
Sorry to inform you guys, but Dina is missing. Her family has reported her missing after she left and went out and never came home.
The teacher said in a despondent tone. My stomach dropped, my fingers tingled. I couldn't believe it. Apparently, that night, she ended up hanging out with a guy whom she met working at the pizza shop. Everything was going alright. She was a beautiful girl. She was a model. So we know what he was thinking. We aren't sure in what order things went down, but she was drugged, raped, and strangled. Then, her vile murderer decided to cut her body into pieces, out her in a steel drum, and light her on fire. I think about that night over and over again. Should I have gone? Would that have really made any difference? Or would he have just killed us both? Her father was an FBI agent, so it truly goes to show that if someone is evil and wants to kill you, then nothing, and I mean nothing, will get in their way. So, Lamar Hamas, please, let's not meet. Articles relating to this story are in the description of this video. This incident happened in the summer of 2015. I live by myself in a nice house inside a small town. Low crime, but still the occasional shady fucker. Anyway, at work that day, on a smoke break, I watched the dog get thrown from a moving car, 4-lane city traffic during the start of rush hour. I ran right out there, scooped his little ass up, and booked it back to my workplace. He was not injured, amazingly. As a bleeding heart animal lover, I decided to take him home with me until I could figure out what to do with him. I have a large amount of cats, and always had. This was my first experience with a dog that I was solely responsible for. This guy was very shy, head hung, tail tucked, jumpy, just looking at me like I was about to beat him. I was clueless on the subject of dog personalities and tendencies. I just knew that they needed to be taken out frequently. His first night with me, we'd been out about 15 times, as I didn't want him shitting in my house. I was having my final cigarette of the day on my porch at around 10:30. The dog was on a lead, chilling under my chair as I smoked and poked about on Reddit. I see a man walking on the sidewalk that runs by my house. He kept glancing up at me before passing. Shortly after he passed my house, he stopped, turned on his heel, and approached.
Hey, can you tell me where 302 Church Street is?
He asked. I told him that I would search the address on my phone, which of course was taking a minute to pull up. He explained he didn't have a phone of his own and was attempting to get to a friend's house, taking small steps towards me the whole time. Finally, the address I summoned came up. It's exactly 2 blocks north of here, right on the southwest corner of the cross street, I told him, pointing in the direction. He kept his eyes locked on me, continuing to slowly move closer. Doggo starts growling very softly at this point. I had forgotten he was even there until now.
Mind if I take a look at the map?
He grinned sheepishly.
I'm bad with directions.
I rose from my seat, pointing again. It's literally just 2 blocks up this road. Just follow the road. 2 blocks. The house will be on your left. Making it very clear that I wasn't going to just hand my phone to him.
Well, can I call them? I need to let them know that I'm coming,
he said, still creeping closer, extending his hand. No, I replied.
How about I text them?
Pushing forward still. Dude, no. I started moving towards my door at this point.
Just let me see your phone.
He was visibly becoming pissed off, clearly trying to contain it and getting way too close to my porch. As a last-ditch effort of getting this dude to fuck off, I say, you need to get the fuck out of my yard. My dog is protective. He'll fuck you up. Hell, I didn't know the first fucking thing about this dog, let alone whether he had the capacity to fuck someone up. I just hoped saying would intimidate pushy phone guy. Like I had said the magic words, Papa springs into action. Finally, the wolf creature from the never-ending story, he emerges like a fucking bullet from under the chair, growling, snarling, barking his little ass off. He jerks me down near off the porch, trying to get at this guy. He sounded and acted like an 80-pound attack dog, not a 40-ish pound timid beagle mix. I was afraid. I didn't know if the pup would turn on me. As stated previously, at the time, I knew absolutely jack shit about this dog. He backed his hindquarters into my legs, almost nudging me to the door. Still carrying on, eyes locked on phone dude and baring his teeth. The guy finally just holds up his hands and backs off, stammers something like,
2 blocks north, yeah?
And begins walking that way. I go inside, cut off my lights and peek out the window at him. He glances at my house, assured that I'm inside, turns and begins walking the completely opposite direction that I pointed him in. Icing on the cake, he pulls out a phone from his pocket and raises it to his ear to make a call. The dog secured his place as a member of my family that night. He is incredibly protective of me and has frightened away another creep since then. He is attached at my hip and has made it known that he is grateful to be in a safe, loving home, wherein he will never again become a projectile from a moving vehicle. His name is Hank, and I truly believe that night would have ended very poorly for me had he not been there. I hitchhiked alone for 3 weeks in the Balkans this summer. Being a girl alone can be risky, but the drivers I encountered were super nice, and some of them even bought me food and water. Everybody was concerned about my safety, but I was just fearless and confident. The incident happened the last days of my trip. Before I start my story, I feel the need to defend hitchhiking. It's not as dangerous as people think. I got 22 rides in total during my trip, and just one went wrong. I don't mean to discourage anybody, especially girls, from hitchhiking, because it's an amazing experience. I myself should have been more careful anyway, but I feel bad for providing people with another hitchhiking gone wrong story, while there are so many beautiful ones. So, I had already hitchhiked successfully through 5 countries, but I had a bad feeling this morning while walking to a gas station outside of a little town. I started asking couples and families if they go my direction, but I was unlucky, so I decided to raise my thumb like I usually did the last weeks. Immediately, a guy stops and asks for sex. I refuse, but he stays 5 minutes trying to convince me. The minute he leaves, another car stops with 2 guys inside. They don't ask for sex, but they look at me in the worst possible way, so I refuse the ride. After 1 minute, a red van stops. The guy is young and good looking, with a nice smile. He looks trustworthy enough. I jump in the van. The first 30 minutes, we make some small talk and things are looking good. But then, he starts to talk about sex. What is wrong with men in this place? I ask him to stop because I feel uncomfortable. He calls me a cold woman and says that I should relax. He starts talking about how hot I am and that his dick is going to explode. I ask him again in my most serious way to stop talking about his penis. I explain to him that I'm not a prostitute and I'm not exchanging rides for sex, so if this is not okay, he can leave me here. He looks serious and he says that he'll take me to my destination. Awkward silence for 10 minutes. Then he says,
Say something. I picked you up to entertain me.
I'm thinking this ride is not good at all. We stop in a place to eat. I'm seriously thinking to stay here and get another ride, but I look around and the place is full of men, not even one woman, and all of them look at me like they want to rape me. I decide to stay with my driver. He looks more serious. Maybe he will be okay. We get back in the car, and after 5 minutes of driving, he tries to convince me to go to this eco-village, only 5 kilometers from here. I refuse multiple times, but he makes the turn anyway. I am very angry and scared. We take a small mountain road. There are indeed signs for this eco-village. I'm thinking that I can get another ride from there. We arrive in this eco-village, but he doesn't stop. He keeps driving. This is the limit for me. I grab my backpack and open the door, then I jump out of the moving van. He keeps driving. I know he will make a turn and come back. I have to find a safe place. There is a woman working on a field. I go and stand in front of her. Indeed, the guy appears again, driving to the highway we were before. He stops the car for a few seconds, then he keeps going. I realize that I'm still in danger, but at least out of this pervert's car. I start walking, my hands were shaking. I arrive in this eco-village. I'm thinking that these people can help me, maybe give me a lift to the highway, because this guy could be waiting for me anywhere, and the road is mostly empty. I enter the eco-village and I go directly to the toilet. Before I enter, a woman stops me and she politely asks me if I paid for the entrance. I tell her that I really need to use the toilet first, and I'm almost crying at this point. She agrees. I enter the toilet and start to cry in shock. I try to relax, but it's hard. I go out of the toilet and this woman is waiting for me. I try to explain to her what happened, but I start crying again. She looks concerned. She brings me to her boss. It's a 50-year-old woman that looked to me like a mother figure, like a fellow woman in this world happy to help. I tried to explain to her what happened while crying. She also looks concerned. She invites me into her bungalow, then out from the back door. At this point she tells me something along the lines of, "Call the police, darling, you're not welcome here," before she slams the door in my face. I can't believe what just happened. I want to shout at her that tomorrow it could be her or her daughter in my place, that she's a mean person, and if this guy is waiting for me, she will be responsible for my rape. But instead I keep crying while exiting the eco-village. I start walking these 5 terrifying kilometers in this empty road. There is a man loading his car with his children around him. I approach him, begging for a lift to the highway, but he just tells me to walk. I think of calling the police, but I don't know their number, and I don't trust them anyway. But looking back, this is what I should have done. I keep walking and walking, trying to calm down. Sometimes, there was a house with a couple of people outside. Other times, there was nobody and I was shitting my pants. Luckily, no sight of a red van, and I finally make it to the highway. Now, I'm crying because of relief. There is a bus stop, and I'm very lucky. The bus comes after 1 hour, and I spend my emergency money for a ticket and arrive safely to my destination. I hitchhiked very carefully one more time after this incident. I think I need some time to feel comfortable on the road again, but I can't simply forget how beautiful hitchhiking can be most of the time. So, I work at a pizza place, usually inside, as my insurance does not cover claims when driving for business, but occasionally, I will cover a delivery shift for one of the drivers because the money is good. Our delivery area includes a few new development upper middle class cookie cutter neighborhoods, an older 1940s era village, some trailer parks, and a bunch of rural areas. Not rural to the point seeing hundreds of stars at night, but enough that you couldn't hear your neighbors yell. So, about a week ago, I was covering a delivery shift. I come back to the shop feeling pretty good. I'm averaging $5 a delivery, and they've all been pretty close, and check to see if I have any more deliveries left. I have one left, to an address that I've never seen before. It's out on one of the more rural roads. I asked the kid who took the order what was up with this because there were special instructions on the ticket. He says, "They said go around the back because the front door is not operational." I'm like, okay, that's not that uncommon. People often want you to just go around the back. Either they painted the door, the house shifted and it's a bitch to open it, or they're just hanging out at the back. As I'm driving out to the house, I get an odd feeling. I don't really like the idea of going to the back of some house out in the sticks. It would all be too easy for some thugs to order a pizza to an abandoned house, then jump the delivery guy. I figure I'll scope the place out when I get there, and if it seems too sketchy, just call them and make up a story about how it's against company policy to go around the back of the house to prevent robberies or something. As I'm driving to the house, I realize it's towards the end of this road that gets less populated the further down you go. Great. I'm pretty near the address and driving slowly. I see this abandoned looking house and set back from the roads with no address and in a bunch of trees. I think to myself, that house better not be it. So I drive past and check the next house's address, and lo and behold, that abandoned looking one was the right house. Shit. At this point, I'm not too worried because it's in the boonies and the standards of upkeep on your house are pretty low, so a house in disrepair isn't unusual. I double back to this house and pull into the driveway. At this point I'm getting bad vibes. It just doesn't feel right. So I park my car at the very end of the driveway with the rear of the car on the shoulder, so anyone passing by can clearly see it. At this point I call back to the shop and tell them that I'm at this sketchy house, and if I don't call back in 4 or 5 minutes, call me, and if I don't answer, call the cops. While I'm on the phone, I take a chance to take a good look at the house. It looks extremely abandoned and not just in disrepair. The driveway is crumbling, bits are gravel and there are weeds growing out of it. There is no mailbox, no trash cans, no car, no lawnmowers, no landscaping, no kids' toys, absolutely nothing in the yard. The yard hasn't been mowed in what looks like years. The house is total crap. The roof is all but falling apart. The siding is falling apart, and the back deck, which comes around the side, is also falling apart. The only part of the house that looks even a little bit decent is the allegedly non-functioning front door. The windows were all shut. They all have the blinds or curtains shut. The few that aren't are actually boarded up. I don't even see any wires running to this house. It's not dark, but it's dusk, and there isn't a single sign of any lights on in this house. At this point, I'm starting to get pretty nervous. I'm a 5'10" male, 180 pounds, not in any great shape, but I did take karate for 10 years, so I'm not helpless, but I do try to avoid any sort of confrontation that I can, as I am mostly a pacifist. I'm not too concerned about getting robbed, no skin off my teeth, it's not my money. I mean, I would rather not get robbed, but I'm mostly worried about getting jumped or killed. It's a fairly safe area, but recently there have been some rather unsavory people moving in from the city. A big spike in home invasions and robberies, but more worrying, a few stabbings and assaults. So it's time to either nut up or shut up. I'm not just going to go charging in that house like a fool, so I get out my phone and call the number they gave when ordering. While I'm doing that, I'm also getting the pizza out and making sure to leave my door open. A running car half in the road at an abandoned house with the door open looks suspicious, right? I figure if shit goes down, it might look out of place enough to make someone stop. Not that there is really any traffic this far down the road anyway. I'm starting to walk up to the house while the phone's ringing. It rings twice, and then an automated message comes on. It says something along the lines of this phone number is associated with an internet texting app. I think it was haywire. We have had issues with people using numbers from those services for pranks in the past. This is a huge red flag. My heart is now pounding in my throat, and my whole body is telling me to bail. I don't want to get a reputation for being a flaky bitch as a driver and lose any future delivery shifts, and that is the reason why I have not bailed out yet. So I'm just standing there holding a pizza looking at this house, but not wanting to venture around to the back of it. I'm hoping that the resident will look out the window and come out by the road to get their food. So I'm looking at the front windows, checking for some sign of life. I see a blind go up on the one window next to the front door, and a really creepy looking man with a hat pulled low and big sunglasses on is looking out. Remember, he's in a completely dark house surrounded by trees at dusk, and there is no reason for him to be wearing sunglasses. I also see what appears to be a silhouette of another man standing behind him in the room, but this could have been anything else. When he sees me looking out, he mouths something and he darts away, presumably towards the allegedly broken front door. At this point I nope the fuck out. I had stayed pretty close to my car, so it was only a few steps away. I jumped into the driver's seat and threw the pizza into my passenger seat, something I would never do since I'm really anal about keeping my car clean. I slam it into reverse before I get the clutch all the way in, so I grind my gears a little. Again, something I never do. Without looking, I simultaneously slam and lock my door and floor it back towards onto the main road, slipping my clutch horribly. But at this point, I don't really care and I don't want to fuck around and risk a stall. I did not even check for cross traffic, really stupid part. I start to drive away and look back at the house. The screen door on the outside of the front door is now open, but the front is still shut. The guy isn't out in the yard. He's just gone, disappeared. So I pull over a little ways up the road to call back to the shop and tell them that I'm all good and that I will explain everything when I get back. The people never called back to inquire about their food. People usually call if their pizza is 15 minutes late, and these people never got it, so it's really strange that they didn't call. pretty much confirming that they were up to no good. After telling my co-workers about it, we concluded that it was definitely a robbery at the very least. So we put the address and phone number on our no deliveries list and ate their pizza. I doubt I would have actually gotten murdered or anything, robbed with maybe a gun pulled or a little roughing up, yes, but it was still very unnerving that I easily could have gotten into something serious, something terrible, just by doing my job, especially if the idiots picked a slightly less abandoned house as a setup. I grew up on the countryside, right next to a national park frequently visited by nature lovers and bird enthusiasts. It was the kind of park where you're not really allowed to bike or ride horses, only walk or run, but 10-year-old me felt like it was a stupid rule, and did so anyway, because the trails were perfect for it. I knew fully well that I wasn't supposed to do that and was caught a few times, but nothing much came of it apart from a half-hearted "don't do it again," and I did, of course, until one day something frightening happened that made me stop. My family were horse breeders, and I would often take on one of the horses for a ride, usually in the Forbidden Park. This day, very early in the morning, the first day of the summer holidays, it was beautiful outdoors, misty and foggy, yet a sky that promised a sunny day ahead. Since it was so early, before 6 o'clock, I knew there wouldn't be anyone on the trail to see me, so I let the horse set off full speed along the trail. I only slowed down on the part of the trail that got a steep on one side, leading down to the river, because the thought of one step too close to the edge was too much, even for a kid with next to non-existing risk assessment skills. Suddenly, the horse came to a halt and refused to take another step. I grew up with horses all my life and knew that usually indicates that you need to do some sort of investigation. Is there something wrong with the hoofs? Did the horse spot something that spooked it? The hoofs were fine, but the horse didn't move an inch. That's when I saw it. Someone had set up a trap. A thin, sharp metal wire across the trail, in perfect neck height for an adult. I stopped and looked around but didn't see anyone. The wire was well attached to 2 trees and impossible for me to remove, so I led the horse around it, and to do so I had to walk a bit up into the wooden area on the side of the trail. That's when I heard the singing. There is a song called Hey Somtaguba, and it was that melody, but the lyrics were different and sung in a muffled, sniggering voice. Today, I only remember parts of it, but translated it would have been something like this. Hey, all of you runners, come here passing, let the lifeblood pour out. I, as silently as I could, with my heart in my throat, backed away, got up on the horse, and hurried back the way I came as fast as I could. I knew I had to tell someone about it, but at the same time, I wanted to avoid admitting to riding a huge and very forbidden horse on those protected trails, so now I had a problem. The old stories about a madman living in a shed in the woods, a shed that was once a cottage for the local hunter, came back to me as I hung on the horse for dear life. I got home and told my brother what had happened, and he went back there with me in tow. We found the wire trap, and after a while of searching we also found a spear-like pole in the ground, right on the spot where you'd land if you came running and jumped over the fallen tree on the trail. That's when we called the police. The area was searched and several similar traps were found, but no sight of the old man. The following summer though, there were big news in the local newspapers about a spear-like poles being found right under the water surface, directly under that little tower you're supposed to dive from at the lake. And black garage barks filled with big rocks were found on the narrow bridge crossing the river, so that if a car had hit it, it would have gone off the road and into the water. I have no idea what the intentions of those people are, but I hope I never meet them. A brief background. My parents got divorced when I was 10, and I lived with my mum and sister until I was 19, when I moved out to live on my own. I'm 6'4", 230 pounds, male, and was about 24 at the time this incident took place. A week after my sister moved out to college, I noticed that my mum was feeling down and I decided to spend the weekend at her place to keep her company and ease the empty nest blues she was going through. I also wanted to get away from my roommate at that time, so I thought it would be an ideal break for me. I got there Friday evening and we planned the next day to start packing and cleaning up my sister's room, since my mum wanted to convert it to a small workshop. So she had the task of getting storage boxes in the morning, and we'd spend the day packing the room. Although I wasn't living very far from her place, my job was keeping me extremely busy, and I hadn't been able to see her in a long while. We had a great time that evening, and I felt like my presence was already lifting her spirits. She woke me up the next day with her ever so perfect cup of tea, and told me that she'll be running to the department store to fetch the storage boxes, and that I'd better be awake and ready by the time she came back. I took a quick shower and sat down in the TV room, and as I took the first couple of sips from my mug, the doorbell rang. I thought it possibly couldn't be Mum because it hadn't been more than half an hour since she's been gone. So I went to the door and looked through the peephole. I saw a man holding a plant, standing and staring at the door. I remember amusingly thinking that Mum must be seeing someone who has ordered this plant to be delivered to her place, but she must have neglected to mention it because she was shy about it or something along those lines. I also wish she was here to receive it herself, as it would have made her very happy. I opened the door and greeted the guy with a smile, and also took a couple of steps forward to help take the plant off his hands. As I was about to extend my arms, one of the most awkward feelings went through my entire body. In a split second, I could sense something was wrong with that picture. He was standing there with a confused look on his face, like a deer in headlights, holding what seemed like a plant in a big and deep brownish porcelain pot, and upon looking at the plant, I noticed it looked like it was snatched from someone's garden. Add to that, the whole thing wasn't wrapped. Glancing at him, I also noticed that he was wearing blue trousers and a grey nylon bomber jacket, with no logo, patch or name tag on it. What's more, he simply looked creepy. He had glazed eyes that looked like he was phased out in another dimension. Sensing the unsettling atmosphere, I stopped, dropped the smile, and abruptly asked, "Yes?"
"Delivery?"
he muttered in a very low voice, and stood there trying to smile, but it made him look even creepier. "Who's it for?" I asked.
I don't know. They said apartment 3A.
"And who's it from?" I asked, but now in a firmer tone.
"Huh? No,"
he answered. I paused, growing more wary and puzzled by his answer. "What flower shop is it from?" He hesitated a bit and replied,
"Roses."
all without breaking his fixated gaze. I knew Roses, which was a small flower shop a few blocks away from my mum's place, but as far as I knew, they didn't deliver. All the while, the man was standing there, face straight and gazing not at me nor behind me, but somewhat beyond me without a real eye contact, as if he was either drunk or high on something. His body language was also emanating even more creepiness. I also noticed that the way he was holding the plant was odd. His left hand was at the bottom of the pot, while his right hand was behind it, out of my sight. "I think you have the wrong address, man," I said, with my gut feeling screaming at me to get away from this creep. As I took a step back, trying to get back into the house while keeping my eyes on him, he moved forward trying to hand me the plant. "Listen, I'm sure you have the wrong house, my friend," I repeated, now that there was less of the safe distance between us. At that moment, it seemed like something in his head snapped, and he took another quicker step forward towards me, drawing dangerously closer. Adrenaline rushed through my veins, and that's when the danger sirens started blaring in my head, and I realized that things were going to get pretty ugly. Now, although I'm a large guy, I'm surprisingly non-confrontational, and I've never been in any fight before. I remembered at that instant a small tip from a friend's self-defense class that I attended with her once, and it was to adjust your balance and fix your feet firmly to the ground before engaging in a fight. So, I quickly moved my right foot back a bit, took a firm position, and as he lunged towards me throwing the plant as if for me to catch it, I threw a heavy right punch that smacked hard on his left temple, throwing him violently slamming face down on the floor. Seeing him down, I quickly ran back inside and locked the door. I stood there looking in the peephole, my heart pounding in fear mixed with fury. He laid still for what seemed like an hour, and I swear I thought he was dead. This sight gave me a tremendous feeling of guilt and felt very sorry for the guy. But then I saw him get up, pick something up from the floor, wobble around disoriented, and rush towards the stairs, tumbling down. I waited a bit, holding my breath, dreading that he might come back up in a flash and smash the door. But he was gone, and it was over. I sat down on the couch in shock and feeling detached from reality. I gazed at the phone in the kitchen, contemplating calling the police, when I heard some clatter in the stairwell and saw the door unlock. I flew off the couch, standing and staring in horror at the door, mouth dry and heart racing. As it flew open, I saw my mum struggling with a stack of storage boxes, asking me to give her a hand. As soon as she was inside, I proceeded to quickly close and lock the door as casually as I could. She then asked me what the mess in the stairwell was about and why I had bloody knuckles. I sat her down and calmly explained to her what happened. She was terrified. We called the cops, who arrived a few minutes later, and I told them the whole story. One officer was taking notes and another wandered around inspecting the stairwell. The officer we talked to was very attentive, and when I mentioned that I punched the guy, he interrupted me saying, "No, you didn't." I kept insisting that I did punch the guy, and he kept shaking his head saying, "No, you did not." Puzzled, my mum and I looked at him wondering what on earth is wrong with this guy, and he proceeded to tell us that if he mentioned this part in his report and they ended up catching the guy, the creep might twist the story, press assault charges against me and walk free. We were shocked. So, he said he was going to note that I pushed him away. They said that they couldn't do anything at this point and that they would keep us posted. The cops left and my mum and I spent the day packing my sister's room in silence, deeply shaken by this incident and trying to go about our life as normally as possible. I was surprised when I got a call from the police a few weeks later, telling me that they caught the creep and asked me to go down to the station to identify him. I went there, and upon peeking through the window of the interrogation room, I told them that it was him. I could also see that he had a large black bump on his head that made him look even freakier. They caught the guy after a woman in another building near my mum's place called the cops when the creep stuck around her stairwell and kept banging on her door after she refused to open and kept jiggling the doorknob. The woman said she knew something was wrong when she noticed his messed up face. He was also carrying a plant. When they caught him, they found an ice pick and duct tape in his pocket. This is when I realized that what he was holding in his right hand, hidden behind the pot, was in fact the ice pick, and it's what he quickly picked up before he ran away. And what's more disturbing, and after further investigation, it turns out that my mum's building's manager was in on it. This same manager is also the manager of the building where they caught the guy. He was the one who pointed the attacker to both apartments in which women were living alone. This happened in 2001 when I was 15. It was during the summer holiday, and me, my best friend and one of my cousins were in a state of permanent boredom. Not much to do in our small town. One weekend, we had managed to convince our parents to let us go on a camping trip on our own, just for 2 nights. We were planning to take the kayaks and make our way to a small island in the archipelago and spend the day fishing and swimming. We were all pretty outdoorsy people and it shouldn't be a problem. We had a great day, and as night approached, we decided to set up our tent and go to sleep. During the process of setting up the tent, my cousin Sophie told us about her last camping trip, where she had been awoken by a curious moose outside of the tent, and we all thought it was hilarious to be scared of a moose. We grilled some fish over the fire before we went to bed, and as we were all pretty tired, we fell asleep instantly. I woke up a few hours later when Bella, my best friend, sat up straight and pointed towards the entry of the tent. "I heard something," she whispered. We sat there listening, but the sound was gone, and after a while we fell asleep again. Soon, I was woken up again, by Sophie this time. "There is someone outside," she stated, her voice laced with a cold kind of fear that made me instantly wide awake. I tried to see or hear any sign of anybody being outside of our tent, but it took several minutes of staring into nothingness before I saw it. A very slow movement, the light summer night allowing a shadow play on the thin canvas of our tent. It wasn't the shadow of a tree or an animal, or was it? It moved so slow that it was hard to know if you imagined it or if it was actually real. We could hear the opening and closing of our cool box, and someone stepping on the coal around the fire pit. Bella gripped my forearm tight as she mimed, "The knife." Sure enough, we had left our knife outside, the one we had used for the fish hours earlier. We sat there in silence. Some unknown person with unknown intent was going through our things, and it was only a matter of time before that someone found our knife. And then what? Would he start stabbing at the tent? We couldn't get up and run. We would be spotted immediately. And anyway, it was a small island. Who would go there in the middle of the night? Or had that person already been there when we arrived and seen us approach? We barely dared to breathe as we waited for something to happen, until the tension was too much for Bella, always the impulsive one, who reached for her flashlight and was making a move to go outside, when we grabbed hold of her and the shadow stopped in its tracks outside. We could hear something being dropped and hitting a rock, then slow steps moving in a half circle around the tent, ending up directly behind us, where we couldn't see it anymore. I've never been so frightened in my life. Suddenly, Bella shouted, "We have a gun, and we phoned the police," with the voice of someone who meant every word she said. There was a soft sound of someone walking on moss, and soon there was nothing but silence. We waited for a while until we worked up the courage to run out of our tent, to the kayaks, and left. We didn't take anything with us, we just left. We were back home at dawn and told my parents what had happened. First they thought we were joking, but when they realized we had actually left all of our stuff, they realized it was real and phoned the police. The police took it more seriously than we had ever thought they would, and there was a reason for that. A few days earlier, a man, an ex-gym teacher, had assaulted his wife very badly and fled the scene before police arrived. They thought he was coming out to avoid being found, and was thought to be dangerous and desperate. We made many more camping trips after this, but we took our dogs with us. So, when my dad was roughly 9 or so years old, him and a couple of his cousins, the oldest 13, were hanging out at a park in Massachusetts. It was summer and a hot day, and the year was 1968, I believe. As he and his cousins were trying to avoid the heat, a man meets them and introduces himself as Stanley Rice, a nice enough looking guy with a camera bag. They strike up conversation and the heat comes up. Stanley mentions an old swimming hole that he knows about in a creek little ways out of town and offers to show them the way. Being naive children in the less suspicious 60s, they agree and set out for the creek. They walk and walk and walk, cross the train tracks a mile out of town, and walk another 20 minutes until the oldest cousin rejoins the group of kids. For the majority of the trip, the oldest had been walking with Stanley and talking to him. As he saunters back to the group, still lazily following Stanley, he whispers to my dad, "That bag has a totally different name on it, and he's got a pistol." As this happens, they reach the swimming hole. They plan to break for it when Stanley gets in the water. Strangely enough, Stanley is already wearing swimming trunks as he strips his pants. He tells the boys to come on in and join him as he dives in the water. They scatter and began running as fast as they can back home. Having watched too many army shows, they start zigzagging back and forth as they hear Stanley cling out and grab the pistol. My dad looked back and the last thing he saw was Stanley Rice on one knee with a Luger pistol pointed at him, yelling his head off. So they all escaped and none of them told their parents. 6 months later, Stanley Rice was arrested. Turns out he was an escaped mental patient whose MO was raping little boys and burying them in the sand of creek beds. Apparently when they caught him, he'd already killed more than 10, I believe, and had 2 kids captive, bound in a van. So that's one of the near-death stories my dad has, in which I almost wasn't born. At the end of May 1999, I was headed into my freshman year of high school. That summer, me and a group of 6 girls from my church went on a mission trip up the coast from Riverside, California to Mount St. Helens, Washington. 3 of the girls' mother acted as our driver and chaperone. We basically all piled into an old Chevy van and a station wagon and headed up PCH and had the trip of a lifetime. I got baptized at a historic mission in San Luis Obispo. We spent 3 days in San Francisco, saw the capital, Portland, Oregon, Yosemite, and basically we got to see every worthy landmark and stay in every noteworthy town from SoCal to the Canadian border. When we stayed in Yosemite National Park, we spent 3 nights at the Cedar Lodge. While in Yosemite and sightseeing, the old Chevy van died in the middle of nowhere. Luckily, even though we were unable to get a phone signal, within an hour somebody stopped and helped us. This was so long ago that I don't remember all the details, but basically the owner of the van told us later that the mechanic told her that somebody tampered with the engine. She was very upset by this and said that it was something that was done intentionally. The van had to be abandoned and we had to use a rental the rest of the way. I don't know if it's a coincidence, but turns out that Carrie Anthony Stainer, aka the Yosemite Killer, was the maintenance man for the Cedar Lodge during this time. He had murdered and decapitated a park ranger by the time we were guests at the lodge. The very next month, he gained access to a room where a woman and her young daughter and her daughter's young friend were staying under the guise of checking their room for something. And basically he knocked on the door in the middle of the night, and because he worked for the lodge, they opened the door. He abducted them, then raped, murdered and decapitated them. I can't say that I remember seeing him, but we probably did, as we were there for 3 full nights. It's just one of those things that I look back on and think that he could have easily knocked on our door, as it was just a few weeks prior that this happened, and decided that he wanted to abduct and kill us. I feel incredibly lucky, as if we dodged a bullet. If the time frame wasn't so close, it wouldn't creep me out as much, but it continues to haunt me 16 years later. To climb the hill, revving the engine loudly. Scared shitless, the 3 of us slid off the side of the hill into the brush, clinging onto plants and rocks. As the truck finally made it atop the hill, slowly driving around the tower, we could see the glow of the headlights each time it circled above us. After waiting for nearly 10 minutes while also trying not to make any noise, the truck eventually descended the hill, stopping in the middle of the trail not more than 100 yards away. We watched as a scruffy man, mid-50s, stepped out of the idling truck and into the glow of its headlights, moseying around while looking at the ground. He then knelt down, looking at something in the dirt, surveying the area intently. As he did so, it became increasingly apparent that he was tracking something. Our footprints. This next part still chills me to the bone. As my friends and I huddled together watching in complete horror, another man wearing a long, dark parka emerged from the brush, right where we had been hiking, joining the other man at his side. Apparently he'd been out there the entire time we were walking the trail, just watching us, following behind at a safe distance. The two of them talked for a long while, but we couldn't hear a word. They continued scanning the area, looking at our footprints, but eventually got in the truck and drove off down one of the forks in the trail. We sat in silence for a long time, waiting nearly 2 hours just to ensure the coast was clear, at which point we made like hell back. It was a type of truck typically owned by a backwoods folk who lived in the boonies and preferred to be left to their own devices. We watched in agonizing anticipation as the truck just idled in place for several minutes before flooring it down one of the other trails, the roar of the engine echoing throughout the canyon. Clearly, we were spooked at this point, the three of us speculating to our next step. Jeff and I were reluctant to continue, while Dave assured us that it was probably nothing, perhaps just a guy off-roading, as he put it. So, with great reluctance, Jeff and I trudged on behind Dave towards the water tower to get his final shots. Nevertheless, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the truck. I mean, I knew plenty of people in high school who would go off-roading for fun in the woods, but never on finicky canyon trails barely wide enough to hike on, let alone drive. It just didn't sit right with me. After walking without interference for about an hour, we finally made it to the water tower, climbed the hill to the top, and took in the view of the city. Dave, once again, started setting up his equipment while Jeff and I stood on both sides of the water tower, keeping watch just in case the truck came back. Nothing. At this point it's around 3 AM. Dave decides that he's got all the shots he needs, so we pack up our equipment and commit to heading back before it gets too late, seeing as how all of us have classes in just a few hours. Just as we're preparing to descend the hill, the truck comes roaring out of the canyon below us, back onto the trail, at which point the driver attempts, surrounded by trees and woods. In order to venture into the canyon itself, you have to follow a main trail with several smaller arteries that split off in other directions, but ultimately culminate after a couple of miles or so at the base of a steep hill adorned with an old water tower overlooking the city. Anyhow, we parked our car at the top of the canyon road, divvied up the camera gear, and made our way out to the trailhead around 1 AM by this point. After walking the trail for about 5 minutes, Dave, the photographer, decided it was time to set up his first shot, while Jeff, our other friend, and I kept watch. Eventually he got the shot he needed, and we continued walking for another 5 or so minutes before Dave decided to set up his next shot. At this point, the trailhead had disappeared behind us completely, and we were a little less than a quarter of the way to the water tower. While setting up the tripod, we noticed the faint glow of headlights off in the distance, which was strange because the trail isn't meant for cars, nor is it big enough for them to pass through. If I recall, it's only about 5 feet wide, with shrubbery on both sides. This was clearly a bit of a red flag for us, as we were the only people out there, so we immediately packed up our things and ducked off into the brush, waiting for the car to pass on. Eventually, an old pickup truck idled to a stop about 50 yards from where we were hiding. The truck itself was old and rickety, sitting on a lifted chassis, the bed of which was missing entirely. Growing up in the country, I knew it About 4 years ago, I was a junior at a small college in LA County. Bordering my town was a large, cavernous region known as the Turnbull Canyon. It's the kind of place that has a healthy amount of creepy folklore surrounding it, with an area emphatically known as Hell's Gates, stories of cultic activity, gang killings, abandoned mental institutions, and the like. The kind of shit you hear about any place old enough to have a reputation. In reality, most of the stories were spurned from a tragedy that occurred years prior. A woman's body was found at the base of the canyon, and from then on the rest is history. Nevertheless, when a photographer friend asked me and another buddy to go out to the canyon in order to take some photos of the LA skyline, I had to oblige. The canyon was about a 30-minute drive from our campus, and we'd been listening to the King of Limbs the entire drive, which proved to be the perfect ambience to get me feeling pretty anxious about our little exertion. I should also note that I'm a pretty anxious guy in general, so travelling out to a remote area, preceded by its reputation for scary occurrences, admittedly had me thinking twice about the decision. At the top of the canyon, there is a small residential area, a few ritzy houses to the car, down the canyon and back to our campus, just in time for class. When I was 18, almost 10 years ago, I had a phone call that completely changed my life. I got woken up at almost 6 AM by an unknown number. I figured it was my boyfriend, now husband, since his phone usually showed up as the famous unknown number. He usually called me before going to work at around 7:30 AM, but sometimes he'd call me at 6ish if he wanted to talk to me while waking up. I answer, and he says,
"Hey baby."
And I'm still half asleep, but start talking. He tells me he has a little problem, and that he's feeling really, being 18 and having to start dating him recently. Let's just say I was very willing to, go and help his demands. So we start, and he tells me how he absolutely loved seeing me last weekend, how good I looked, how he absolutely loved my hot red panties. He basically described what we had done during the weekend, and how much he loved some of the things I did to him. I replied I was more and more awake and we were having a really good time. Then I noticed it was almost 7 AM and basically asked him, "So this is fun and all, but aren't you going to get ready for work?" This is giving me chills typing this, but he basically replied,
No, I think I'll skip work today.